Good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning. My name is Gil Cleland. I'm the pastor of Sanctuary London here in London, Ontario. This here is my office. Welcome to my office. We get to hang out together for the next 20 minutes to half hour, and we're going to be chatting about the book of Exodus. Right at the beginning of the book of Exodus is some amazing stories we want to share this morning and look at this morning. But to get there, I want to talk about the idea of the unlikely hero. The unlikely hero. Many of us, when we were kids, loved the likely hero, the one who has all the superpowers. Superman, obviously, being the most obvious of all of them, the one who has super strength, super speed, and all of those things. And he took on supervillains, of course. But the unlikely hero is a fascinating story. It's the person or character who takes on the bad guy but doesn't have any of the superpowers. They just do it out of faith, or they do it out of love, or they do it out of loyalty. And they do it because they feel it's right. And so we're going to be looking at a story this morning of unlikely heroes. People that, against all odds, stood up against what is a powerful, powerful being. And so to get there, let's open up the book of Exodus. Today we're going to be studying the book of the opening chapters of the book of Exodus, and I've got my NIV in front of me this morning. So if you want to open up your NIV to Exodus 1, starting at verse 8, I'm going to be reading to 2 verse 10. So allow me to read to you this morning the word of Scripture. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave our country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more that they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the field, and all their hard labor the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all of his people, Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. May God be blessed in the reading of his holy scriptures this morning. So, we have a story, an introduction to a story anyways, that becomes the formative story of Israel. Israel saw herself as the redeemed people, the drawn out of Egypt people, the rescued people. And it becomes the narrative that forms them for the rest of their existence and to this day. That God, in his sovereign love for his people, will rescue his people from oppression, will take them out of Egypt, no matter what the Egypt is. Now, this story goes back, obviously, a couple of thousands of years, and speaks to a time in ancient Israel before they wrote down their stories. So these stories come from what is known as an oral tradition. So these are the stories they told one another again and again and again. They told one another these stories. These are the stories that they would tell at Passover. These are the stories they would tell to their children and to their grandchildren. These are the stories that said, this is who we are. And so they remembered little details in this story, like how the basket was made, very interesting. The names of the midwives, very interesting. That these little details are remembered and held onto as very important, because these are the stories of who we are. It wasn't a story of just looking back. It was a story of saying, this is who we are today. So when they finally did write most of this down, and as far as we know, that happened while the Israelites were in exile, these stories become formative for them then, because they would have seen the rulers of their oppressing nation, whether it's Assyria or Babylon or wherever they are in exile. They would have seen them as a parallel to Pharaoh. Why are we being oppressed right now? Because we have this oppressive regime, this empire over us. And what does it look like for us to get out of this? We act in the same way as we have acted in the past. So they read these stories to say, how do we act now? Who should we be now? How do we act when we are in the place of oppression now? And so to this day, Israel, and through her Messiah, the followers of Jesus, therefore us Christians, read the story in the same way. This story becomes how do we respond when things of oppression are over top of us, when it looks impossible to take anything and run with it and make a free life. We feel like we're in some sort of prison, some sort of oppression. How do we live and what do we do? These stories still speak to us today. So the way I want to look at this story is, first of all, how the story unfolds in its narrative. And it's a zoom out, zoom in kind of narrative. A zoom out, zoom in kind of narrative. I don't know if you've seen pictures of the Earth and from outer space, and they do a big picture of all of the Earth at once, and then with the amazing wonder of what you can do with technology today, they zoom in and keep zooming in and keep zooming in, and then finally they land in somebody's backyard in California, usually in the movies that you watch. But the idea of zooming out, seeing the whole picture, and then zooming in and seeing a very specific part of the picture is a way of telling stories then and today. We see it in the creation narrative that God makes all the world and all of creation and puts them in place, calls them all good, and calls humanity very good. And then there's a zoom-in story right after the creation of humanity, a zoom-in story which says the intimacy of God breathing into his dust and creating humanity, and a very specific call and a very specific talking to humanity, not just calling them very good, but this intimate connection with his Adam, his humanity that is created. So we have a same thing going on here, a zoom out, first of all, and then a zoom in story. So let's look at the zoom out story. And it's that beginning part that we read. that a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power and in Egypt, and he says to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous. We must deal shrewdly with them. This is the way of empire. This is the way of empire. Empire does things like this all of the time. That they see a people group, a large people group, and they don't see, hey, that's interesting. Look at those people. Those are fun. They're nice. They're delightful, which the rest of us might think. Empires see a large gathering of people and begin to fear them because they know, empires know, the way they got to power was that at one point they were the oppressed. And for all of human history, this is how it works. That there was an oppressor and there was the oppressed. The oppressor maintains violence over the oppressed for a long period of time. Finally, the oppressed gather in numbers and grow and grow and grow enough that they can overthrow the empire and become the new empire themselves. That's human history in a nutshell, is that we always keep getting a bigger, better weapon to crush the other people group. And then these guys grow and they crush that one. And so you have this movement back and forth throughout history of one people group crushing another people group again and again and again. So empires fear large gatherings of people groups. And that's what they saw when they saw Israel. They saw this growing people group that they should be fearful of, that they should be afraid of. And so they do violence to them. They make them do dehumanizing work. They make the Israelites not human, but part of the imperial machine. You will build stuff for us. You will do harsh labor for us. They don't recognize that each person in this group is human. They keep them at a distance. It's easy to dehumanize people, to imagine that they're not worth the stuff that the rest of us have. And empires do this better than others. And what I often find troubling is when imperial mindsets trickle down into the rest of our mindsets, and we start believing that about people as well. That they're not worthy of love. They're not worthy of good things. They're not worthy of all the joys of life, but they are worthy only to be in this position of oppression. And so what we want to look at now is how that Israel responds to this crushing. And what we see is that in her obedience to her God, Yahweh, that Israel continues to grow. Israel continues to multiply. No matter how much they are being crushed, no matter how much they are being oppressed, they continue to grow, they continue to multiply. And so then we have in this story a zoom in moment. A zoom in moment. That was the zoom out. This is what's happening on the big picture. So we have the zoom in of Pharaoh. We have the specific, the leader of the empire, going to two unlikely people in the Hebrew world. These midwives. And their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They're named because they are remembered. That Israel held up these two women as the unlikely heroes, the people who got it, who understood it. And Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world of that day, approaches these women and says, I want you to destroy Israel in 1 generation. What does he say specifically? He said, kill all the boys. When that boy is born, I want you to destroy it. And in doing so, we will get rid of all of Israel in 1 generation. There will be no men. There will be no procreation. There will be no way to maintain you guys. And you will die off. Your species will be gone from the world. That's Pharaoh's plan. So he assumes that these two midwives would fear him because he can bring their death. But it doesn't say that in Scripture, does it? It doesn't say that the two feared him. It said the two of them feared God. The two of them feared God. And in fearing God, they did what is right. They did justice. to all of the boys. They let the boys live. This was their intimate calling in life, to be part of life, to be part of giving life, to be there with the women, to be there with the family as that child is being born and being brought into this world, and to nurture the mom and to nurture the child. And Pharaoh asked them to do the exact opposite of all of their callings, and in fear not of Pharaoh, but of God, they chose to lie to Pharaoh, say, I don't know what happened. These women just all of a sudden are having the babies. We try to get there, but the babies are already born and we can't do anything. They lied to Pharaoh to do justice for humanity. And that to me is the amazing part of these unlikely heroes, these two women who stood up to the most powerful man in the world because they did not fear him, they feared God. Now, this is a weird thing. We don't think we should be fearing God. Many of us have this image that we should be loving God, which is right, and understanding God, which is right, and coming to a greater relationship with God, which is right. But a healthy fear declares that the object of our fear is bigger and better and more amazing than we can imagine. And bigger and more amazing can be devastating and terrible on one side, but can also be beautiful on the other. When I stand at the edge of Niagara Falls, I have great fear of what this water can possibly do, and I see it in tremendous power and beauty. I don't fear it because it's a scary thing that is going to do violence to me and is out to get me. I fear it because of its great power and wonder. And that's in the way that we are to be fearing God, of his great power and wonder and joy and love. And what that fear does is it draws us from our sense of just being in the middle, our normal, our just daily living. So most of us kind of sit in the middle of life, and we sit there and we're in the normal, and we're just kind of getting by, and we're doing life. And what God is calling us is to go to the edges of life, not the bad and the terrible over here where Pharaoh is, but to over here where God is. And in that you will be changed. You can't stay in the middle anymore and just have a normal life of distraction and ignoring the pains of the world. If you are drawn to God and begin to fear him because he's on the edges of life, then we begin to live fully, and we engage that we're worthy, and we're engaged that we are people of love, and those things cause us great fear. And God calls us to those things, and this passage calls us to those things, that we are to fear those things because we too will be changed. But this story of these two women is to bring us an amazing response of joy, of justice, and of serving God no matter what. Because we fear not the one who can give us death, Pharaoh, but we fear the one who can give us life, Yahweh, God. So women respond to Pharaoh, they lie. And what this does throughout the history of Israel and then into the history of Christianity is we look at these unlikely heroes and say, if they could do it, so can we. No matter the situation, you can't think of a weaker person in the place of an ancient world than a woman of a foreign nation under an oppressive regime of a man. You can't think of someone who is weaker in that situation, in the way that history was going at the time, that women didn't have a place. But who are the people that stand up to Pharaoh? These two women. And that trickles down throughout history and says, if they could do it, so can you. If they can trust God in the middle of their oppression, so can you. And I ask you now, what are the things that are holding you back? What are the things that say they feel oppressive? They feel like they're very fearful, and they perhaps scare you. Perhaps it's a way of sharing our faith, that we don't want to be made fun of and we don't want to stick out, and we'd rather just go home and watch TV and live lives of distraction somewhere in the middle, where God is calling us to the edges of life and saying, no, I want you to fear me over here. I want you to be like these two midwives who stood up to the oppressors all around them and said, no, we're going to do what is right. Now, the rest of the story is a fascinating story. It is a story that we have set up in our way of telling it, that Israel is over here and empire is over here, and that Israel is amazing and empire is terrible. And what we can do is perpetuate what is around us today is a polarized world. That we think we're over here and the bad guys are over here all the time. The rest of this story is a much more nuanced story. It's the birth of Moses. Moses was born to a Levite man and a Levite woman. And after a few months of knowing that we can no longer have him. That's what the mom and dad thought. In fact, it's the mom again that is zoomed in on. That's the important part of this story. Another woman is the hero. And she realizes if she begins to walk around with young baby male Moses, that he will be put to death, because the word went out to all of Egypt, all of Israel. If there is a boy born, he is to be killed. He is to be thrown into the Nile. So she fears for her son, and in fear for her son, wraps him in blankets, puts him in the basket, puts him into the edge of the Nile, and releases him, hopes for the best. She'd rather have him go off and not know how he's going to turn out, not know where he's going to end up. Will somebody pick him up? Will he end up staying on the Nile? She has no idea. She just releases him and hopes for the best. And how many of us need to hear that? How many of us have held on to our Moses of life, that we hold on to it, even though it will get crushed, even though it won't turn out the way we want to. We want to control it. We want to hold on to it. And we think we need to hold on to those things. One of the toughest things I've learned as a parent, one of the toughest things I've learned as a friend, is that the best relationships are relationships of release. That true love is not holding on to someone, but releasing them. And inviting them, yes, to be in relationship with you, but not to hold on to all the tight details of that person. Not to hold on to them in such a crushing manner that it oppresses them. That is abuse. And when release someone, that is love. So in a very real way, she loves her child by releasing her child from what would have been his ultimate death for sure into what might be a life. And she doesn't know. So she sends her daughter, Moses' sister, to watch what is happening. And she watches from a distance. And there comes Pharaoh's daughter, comes down and sees the child, hears the crying. And here's the fascinating thing. We had Israel and we had empire. You can't get closer to empire than daughter of Pharaoh. That's the kindred of the Pharaoh. This is the one that should be following all the rules, that should be doing it right. And here she hears the cry. And when she hears the cry, her heart breaks and says, that is a human being. In the heart of the empire, somebody gets the idea that all people are human beings by hearing them cry. This is a powerful, powerful image for us who have lived in this polarized world where the good guys are over here and the bad guys are over here, and we think the bad guys think this all the time and they're terrible and they have their philosophies and their mindsets and all of their things. And the writer reminds the Israelites that deep in the heart of what you think is the bad guy are people who, when they hear the cry, when they hear that you are truly human, remember that you are truly human. And that to me is very exciting. That inside each one of us, no matter how far we've strayed, no matter how far we've gone, there is this sense that we can be drawn back to rehumanize people, re-hear their cry, go where there is to be justice, and respond well to it. And of course, the rest of the story turns out a little bit like a fairy tale, where the daughter or Moses' sister says, "Hey, I can get you a wet nurse for that child," and goes and gets her mom, which is Moses' mom as well, and that becomes the nurse for Moses. And then the Pharaoh's daughter raises Moses as her own inside of Pharaoh's court. So it sounds like a fairy tale ending, and it sounds like things have all turned out, because Moses actually lives. He is released to the Nile, and somehow he lives. And somehow that's the exciting stuff. But what the story we're going to look at next week is there's an anticipation already that if you are raised within the empire kind of sneaks into your heart. So there's already a foretaste of the things not turning out the way they possibly could. And we'll be looking further at that next week. So, where are we now, and how do we bring this idea to completion? I want to just walk through the story one more time and highlight some of the stuff that seems to stick out to me. First of all, if they can do it, you can too. If they can do it, you can too. Many of us are facing things that oppress us and feel like they're crushing us and feel like they're in on our shoulders and they're holding us back. And at that point, we have to ask ourselves, are we more fearful of that, or are we in a relationship with God, not just of fear but of love, of joy and wonder, that we're not fearful of the death things, but then we become fearful of the life things. The life things are going to come along beside us when we start following God, and they will be in abundance, that there will be a growth, that there will be amazing things that you cannot control. That's why we fear them. And they're going to spill out all over the place. But we tend to try to organize and to try to control. And we need to give up that control and say, no, I'm going to let God do this stuff. I'm going to let God just do his thing, and I'm going to lift off the oppression that is there on my shoulders and allow God's life into me so that I may truly live. And then I want you to see the other side of it, is that within the people that we have tended to written off is a truly human being. That people that we tend to say, well, they're this type or they're this type, and they're stuck within their ways, can, not all the time, but can be truly human. They can see the humanity in others. Another way of saying this is no one is beyond hope. No one is beyond redemption. No one is beyond saving. That God's love, God's wonder, his joy, his way that he works in us is way more powerful than any imperial mindset can possibly be. And that, my friends, gives me hope. Amen? Amen.